Well, welcome those who are joining us. We have a few minutes before we get started. Well, welcome everyone to Open Ed Live. Welcome everyone, glad you're here. This is an exciting event for us. Let's go ahead and get started. I know that many of you are sharing where you're from in the chat. Let's keep that up. Some of you are joining us in the morning. For some of you, it's the late afternoon. We're excited to welcome you here to Open Ed Live 2025. I'd like to welcome my colleagues, librarians, instructional designers, faculty members, and others, all interested in exploring the boundless opportunities of open education. It's exciting to be part of this movement that extends learning to all throughout their lives. Glad you could take a moment out of your day to join us for this 3-day event, Open Ed Live 2025. Welcome. At Open Ed Live, I'm looking forward all to the interactive sessions, the engagement. There's the keynote, of course, collaborative drop-in sessions, engaging conversations all throughout. All of the sessions will be recorded except for the drop-in sessions to ensure your confidentiality with what you share. So you can return to those recordings later or just go back and see what you may have missed. Plan early to complete the Open Ed Live feedback survey because this is your opportunity to shape next year's experience. We take your feedback incredibly seriously. Open Ed Live 2025 is your hub, it's your network. Use this time to strengthen your ties, raise your consciousness, enhance your practice. This is our second annual event that preludes Open Education Week, and that'll occur March. Open Education Week is on March 3rd through the 7th. That's the annual global celebration I'm sure you're familiar with, where educators can actively share their achievements in open education with each other, and it's a great learning experience. Many events are occurring throughout the week, and you probably know of a few. Feel free to share that in the chat. Now, after Open Education Week, you can keep the momentum going. There is the OER boot camp, that you don't want to miss. That's offered by our friends at the Florida Virtual Campus. That occurs March 26th to the 28th. Its main focus is adopting, adapting, authoring OER. The Top Kit workshop occurs about the same time, but for those who are passionate about faculty development or online teaching. That's also a lot of fun. Great learning experiences, great place to share. So hopefully you've been sharing in the chat some events that you're interested in. I'm sure your colleagues would appreciate knowing about. Right. Today, we have an exciting lineup of speakers, rock stars, and I'll review that momentarily. You are welcome to go ahead and navigate to the agenda. There you can see that Open Ed Live has a plethora of opportunities to engage. The event platform is set up just for engaging and interacting. You can win special Open Education Live certificates through contests. We have the leaderboard contests, earn points on the leaderboard by completing challenges, adding sessions to your agenda, beefing up your profile, completing the feedback survey. The highest point leader wins. There's the photo contest. Just snap a fun photo of your hydration station or your caffeine setup, and enter the photo contest. The photo with the highest likes wins. You can too have the opportunity to win the icebreaker contest. The most creative entry wins. Just post a little bit about yourself. And open education has come a long way over the past few years. We've seen rapid growth in OER, an increase in accessibility practices, the integration of cutting-edge technologies like AI. So open educational resources has really just burgeoned in its adoption. This year at Open Ed Live 2025, we're diving into the implications of these changes. We'll get a peek into innovative practices that enhance student accessibility, that form bridges for lifelong learning. Topics we'll cover are AI-powered innovations, strategies for scaling, fostering lifelong learning pathways, as well as global through open education. Open Ed Live 2025 is your hub. It's your network. Use this time to strengthen your ties, raise your consciousness again, innovate your practice. So let's give it a few more minutes for people to join so that we can get ramped up for a keynote. I'm so excited about the lineup. So many renowned speakers joining us. So let's go ahead. Oh, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's see where people are from. Queens, New York. St. Albert, Alberta. Yeah. British Columbia, Canada. Baltimore. All over. Thank you for taking a moment out of your week to come join us here for the Open Ed Live 2025. Some from Florida, Ohio. Awesome. Boca, Uruguay. I wonder who is joining us from a location that's farthest from Orlando, Florida, where many of us are have our offices here at the University of Central Florida. All right. I wonder what events are coming up. Just go ahead and take a moment to search for an Open Education Week event that, oh, Chicago, Illinois is awesome, but now in Southwest Florida. Well, welcome, Tim. Welcome, Vanja from California. It's morning for you. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is Ada. Yep, from Uruguay. Well, welcome, everyone. Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, if you're just joining us, please make sure to share in the chat where you're from and also any events that might be coming up next week for Open Ed Week or OE Week, whichever you prefer. Jamaica, welcome, Richard. All right, we'll get started with Open Ed Week momentarily. Oh, Open Ed Live, listen to me. I'm already anticipating next week with OE Week. Universities of Wisconsin Stout, welcome, Amber. Welcome, everyone. Librarians, faculty, instructional designers, others who are interested in exploring the bounds of open education, innovating with it. Yeah. All right. We absolutely have a rock star lineup for Open Ed Live 2025. We're so fortunate to have these renowned speakers with us here today. David Wiley is our keynote. He'll provide thought-provoking insights on the future of open education in a world increasingly influenced by AI. AI has touched our work in so many ways. It'll be great to hear from David. On the hour that follows, David Wiley and Kevin Corcoran will have a drop-in session. Then on the next hour, Jeff Gallant and Richard Drake will present guidelines, practical applications for generative AI and OER. It's about time to kick off Open Ed Live 2025. We'll begin with our keynote session momentarily. First, I'm going to introduce the University of Central Florida's Associate Vice Provost for Digital Learning. He's known as our open education extraordinaire around here. Please welcome Kevin Corcoran.
Thank you, Amanda. I don't know where I got that title or that promotion, but thank you so much. I don't know that it's yet 12 p.m. Eastern time yet, so I guess I'm going to do a little fill. I appreciate seeing so many familiar faces in the chat and folks joining from across the country. I'm glad to see international folks. I would be remiss if I didn't have at least a positive comment to our Canadian friends, and congratulations to their win in hockey recently. But that's not why we're here. It's great to see that last year we had over 400 folks in attendance, and this year we've beat our record, and we have over 900 folks that have registered for this event. And it's great to see the participant list continue to grow. And I can't wait to introduce our keynote in just a couple of minutes. So just hold tight and we'll be ready to go.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to see so many people here from across the United States and even outside of the United States, Canada, Uruguay, Jamaica. And I'm interested in learning more about how they're innovating with open education. So I look forward to the drop-in sessions where we can have those conversations. And we'll give it another minute for the hour to strike, and we'll hear from David Wiley for his keynote. All right, Open Ed Live will start in just a minute. Yeah, it might be time to call up David, and as soon as he's ready, hear more about open education and AI.
I just want to ask my UCF folks, are we good? We're ready to go?
We are ready.
All right, well, welcome everyone to Open Ed Live, University of Central Florida's week-long program. I'm so thrilled that you're able to join us today. Hopefully you can come back again for the next 2 days and hear some other presentations, but I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our keynote. I could go through all of David's accomplishments and talk about his role in being on the Mount Rushmore of Open, but I'm not going to do that. I can talk about all his innovations and his contributions towards instructional design, but I'm not going to do that either. I'm going to talk briefly about the first time I met the legend David Wiley. It was over 10 years ago. It was during an event that was in Vancouver, British Columbia. David had a very important and engaging role all that week. And here I was, new to the movement and just trying to get 5 minutes within the man, the legend, the myth. And it got to the end of the week, and folks were starting to leave the conference and go back to their hotels or go to the airport. And I got a text message on my phone saying, I'm in the lobby, I'm on the couch, come and sit with me. The man was clearly exhausted. but he sat and spent an hour with me, spoon feeding me what I needed, giving me the encouragement I needed. This is the man I know. This is the man I am proud to introduce, and I can't wait for him to share his insights on AI and open. So, Dr. David Wiley, please take the floor.
Kevin, thank you so much. That introduction means more to me than I can say. I'm really moved by it, actually. So now you've ruined me for the presentation. Thanks a lot, Kevin. I am so grateful for this invitation and for the opportunity to be here and to share some thinking with you about where things are going with open education in this kind of age of generative AI that we are in and progressing through. These slides are openly licensed. There'll be a QR code on the final slide that you'll be able to use to get back to them. So you will have a copy of these. So don't worry about like thinking about taking notes or anything like that. There'll be a QR code at the end and you'll just be able to click it quickly and have the slides should you decide that you want them. I wanted to provide a little prelude here. In addition to teaching in the ed school, I occasionally teach in the business school as well. And one of the axioms of entrepreneurship is that you need to fall in love with the problem and not your solution. And I want to talk about that just for a minute as a framework for the rest of the conversation that we're going to have today. There are several kind of famous examples that we point to through history as we think about the importance of falling in love with the problem, not your solution. One of them is this problem that people need a way to keep food and drinks and other items cold. So at some point in the past, one solution was harvesting ice from frozen lakes and shipping it to customers' homes, and that allowed them to keep their food and their drinks and their other items cold. Then, with some technological progress, it became possible to make ice on an industrial scale closer to customers' homes and have a much quicker and more cost-effective delivery to their homes. Then, with a little additional technological progress, in-home refrigeration and freezer units came into existence, and we didn't need ice delivery at all anymore. You had the technology in your own home to keep your food and your drinks and your other items cold. And the lesson here for all of us is that problems stay the same and solutions will change over time, and those changes are normally driven by technological advances. And if you are a person who is in love with the problem, in other words, you're really deeply committed to solving the problem, then as new technologies with new affordances become available, you will leverage those to provide better and better solutions to the problem. However, if you fall in love with your specific solution, like making ice and delivering giant cubes of ice to customers' homes, if you're in love with your solution and not able to think flexibly about what you might need to do next, then eventually you get left behind because people want the greater affordability, the greater convenience of the newer solutions. Another example we might look at here is a problem where people want to listen to the songs that they like when they like to listen to them. And so, of course, there have been many solutions to this problem over the years. And, people or companies that created cassette tapes, if they weren't willing to get into the compact disc business when the time came, they just went out of business because there's really not much of a market for cassette tapes anymore, or for MP3 players, for that fact. So I just want to keep us focused on this idea of being in love with the problem and not obsessing so much over our particular solutions, and have that be something that's just rummaging around in the back of your mind as we progress through the talk today. For over 25 years, the open education movement has worked to solve the problem of limited access to educational opportunity. And for that over 25 years, the primary solution has been open educational resources. So you might see where this is pointing, but let's take a minute and enjoy the ride while we get there. I thought I'd share a little bit of my story and how I come to this work. I think it's so fascinating to hear everyone's stories. Obviously, you can't major in open ed at university, so everyone comes to this through some kind of from some side direction. But just to give you a little sense of where I'm coming from and my experience, I wanted to tell briefly a little bit of my story, my experience, kind of getting into open ed. In 1998, I was the webmaster at Marshall University, which is my alma mater here in West Virginia. And I remember very clearly at work one day having this epiphany. And I say here it's a personal epiphany because it's certainly not anything that I was the first person to understand. Economists have vocabulary for talking about this. People had known and understood this principle for a long time, but it was new to me and it occurred to me and it struck me with great power. And that was that there's something really different between information that's captured in a physical artifact and information that's captured in a digital artifact. And the primary difference there being that if my wife is sitting across the table from me reading a section of a printed newspaper, I can't read that same section until she's done with it and puts it down and I can pick it up and start reading it again. When information is captured in physical form, we have to compete for access to that resource, whether it's a copy of a book on a shelf. If the book is gone, you have to wait for it to be returned. All physical artifacts have this property. But if I take that same news and instead of publishing it in print, if I publish it online in a digital format, now suddenly 1 million people can all read the same news at the same time. This idea of digital resources being non-rivalrous is so obvious to us now. It's kind of hard to see and appreciate. But think for a minute about what would happen if you went to watch a YouTube video and you received a message that said, "I'm sorry, someone else is watching this video right now. Please hold." And when they've finished watching it, then you'll be able to watch it. That's just not the way the digital world works. Digital resources have this non-rivalrous property. And these digital resources are incredibly easy to copy. You can copy them at essentially no cost. You can send them around the world at essentially no cost. And very early on in the days of the internet, people figured this out and created tools like Napster and LimeWire and others for sharing music files over the internet, taking advantage of this non-rivalrous nature of digital formats. However, just because sharing was possible on the internet did not mean that it was legal to share. And lots of people found that out and got sued into oblivion during the MP3 days. This is true in part because there was a time previously when the creative works that we made, the documents that we write, the pictures that we take, the video that we might record, there was a time when you created something, there was no sense of copyright interacting with that thing that you had created. Your 7-year-old drew a crayon drawing, and of course you wouldn't copyright that crayon drawing because what would be the point of copyrighting it? But at some point in the past, and it's different in every country, but at some point in the past, each of our countries have now become signatories to the Berne Convention. And one of the requirements of the Berne Convention is that local legislation change so that anytime anything is created, at the moment of its creation, it's fully copyrighted to the full extent of the law without any requirement for registration or anything else like that. So that, if your 11-year-old niece does a watercolor of Harry Potter, that watercolor enjoys the same level and degree of copyright protection as the films or as the books. Automatic copyright had become this thing, and the internet was making it possible for us to share, but this automatic copywriting of everything was making it illegal for us to share. And so later that summer, I thought we ought to be taking advantage of this magical nature of digital resources, and we ought to be sharing them with each other. And earlier that year, in February of that year, the words open source had been coined to describe free, what we would today call free and open source software. It was called free software before that. There's a long history here of terminology of free software versus open source software. I'm not going to go into that. But this idea of open source software where we share source code, we use copyright licenses to tell others, I hereby give you permission to make your own copy of this thing, to change it in the ways that you need or want to change it, and to do whatever you want to do with it afterwards. That idea of open source was just a couple months old at that point, and I thought that was really inspiring. And I thought that that's something that we could leverage in the education context as well. And so I created this website, opencontent.org, and created a license that was a copyright license based on the open source software licenses that tailored to people who had educational materials that maybe they would like to share, and kind of sent this idea out into the world and started advocating that it might be a good idea for us to openly license educational materials and share them with each other. And the idea here was that what the internet made technically possible, open licenses could also make legal, because it seemed like there was an awful lot of opportunity that we were missing out on to share, to improve, to share back, to grow, all the things that, if you have been in the open education movement for a while, these things that we're familiar with, these values that we're familiar with. So I think of OER as being a really kind of incremental innovation. You start with existing resources like textbooks and journals and photographs and films and whatever they might have been. And at some point, you convert those into digital versions and they become non-rivalrous. And then the internet comes along and you put those digital versions on the internet, and now they can be accessed by anyone, anytime, anywhere, essentially instantaneously and essentially for free. And then you take those digital versions that have been published on the internet and you release them under an open license, and now they can all be retained, revised, remixed, reused, redistributed by anyone, anytime, anywhere, legally. But it definitely builds on these layers of innovation that came before. So what are the affordances at the next innovation layer that we ought to be paying attention to? I think about the beginning of the open education movement as happening kind of at the dawn of the information age, right? That digital had just become a widely available technology. The internet was just starting to kind of hit people's homes. But today we're in a transition from an information age. I'm sure someone else will have a better name for it. But what I think of as the generative age. And it's a time where, 27 years ago now, the most powerful emerging technology was the internet. And we were trying to figure out how to leverage that. Today, the most powerful emerging technology is generative AI, and we're trying to figure out how to leverage that. When I think about the affordances of generative AI, there are obviously a lot of them, but just one example that I think applies directly to all of us in this conversation is the way that you can use it to create educational resources kind of to spec, right? You can say, I need a resource on this topic using these kinds of examples, employing this kind of pedagogy. I want this sort of practice and this kind of feedback. And by the way, I need it in Spanish. That's the kind of thing that you can say to generative AI, and it's a very different affordance from any kind of technology that we've seen before. If you're familiar with the Drake equation, I think this is a fun little way of thinking about the kind of problems that we have sometimes trying to locate OER. The Drake equation is this estimate of how the number of life forms out there in the universe that we might be able to communicate with. And you can see that, N is the number of civilizations. I said universe, I should have said galaxy, excuse my imprecision. But you take kind of the average rate of star formation and then multiply that by what fraction of those stars have planets, what fractions of those planets can support life, what fraction of those planets that support life actually develop life, what fraction of that life becomes intelligent, and you kind of multiply all of these out, and this funnel narrows down very rapidly until you might have some estimate of how many civilizations there are in the galaxy that we might communicate with at some point. It's just kind of a fun thought exercise. But when you go to find OER, I think it works in a very similar kind of way, right? First, you have to hope that someone else somewhere has already created the resource that you need. Then you have to hope that that source was openly licensed. Then you have to hope that they published it online somewhere where Google could find it, or they put it in a repository with appropriate metadata. Then you have to hope that Google actually indexed it in some useful way, or that you're able to locate the repository where it's been stored. And then finally, you have to hope that in all of your searching, you actually successfully find this resource. So it feels very much like the Drake equation, kind of narrowing down our odds of finding the resource that we need. Where with generative AI, you go to the AI and say, I need a resource on this topic, and it creates it. So it's a very different kind of experience. So as we think about falling in love with the problem, or staying in love with the problem, right? If the problem that open education has been committed to is overcoming this limited access to educational opportunity, and the incumbent solution is definitely open educational resources. But if it really is the case that generative AI can provide access to dramatically more resources on more topics, in more languages, in more formats, then our current approach to OER, which is create each, someone sits down and manually creates the OER, then that process can. If all those things are true, then it's probably time for us to start thinking about a next generation of solutions. And those would be ones that would really leverage the affordances of generative AI. So I want to talk about some near-term and medium-term solutions from this next generation that are going to integrate generative AI into the kind of work that we're doing in open education. And so the near-term ones I'm going to characterize as kind of horseless carriage approaches. These are solutions that will stay focused on resources. And then I want to think, just want to kind of try to cast our minds not very far into the future, medium term, 2 years, 3 years. And as we get more experience working with generative AI and come to understand the affordances a little more clearly, I think we'll see that newer solutions will focus more on pedagogy and evidence-based practices. And this actually is not unlike the trajectory that the open education community has been on, starting with everything being about OER, and OER kind of exclusively for the first 15, 18 years. And only later this interest in OER-enabled pedagogies kind of coming along and drafting behind that interest in OER. It starts with resources and eventually moves to pedagogy. I think we'll see something similar here with generative AI. So let's talk about the near term for a minute. I understand that this is a minefield, and I'm not trying to step on anything in particular here, but I think it's important that words have meanings. So I'm just going to say, when I say OER, what I mean is this: teaching, learning, and research materials that reside in the public domain or have been released under open license that permits their free use and repurposing by others. This is a pretty common definition. You might have a slightly different one locally. This is the one I'm working. So we'd think about journal articles, book chapters, essays, entire textbooks. It's what you think about when you think, I think when most of us think of OER, it's kinds of things that we think about. And I think that generative AI really has profound implications for traditional OER in the ways that they're authored, in the ways that they're revised, and in the ways that they're remixed. So I just wanted to kind of linger here and ponder for a minute about what those implications are. For authoring, for over 25 years now, we've handcrafted every OER that we've ever created, really. We didn't have another choice. But when you use generative AI in the process of creating OER, you can reduce the amount of time and the resources it takes to get to that first full finished draft by an order of magnitude at least. And by that, I literally mean divide by 10. And that's been our experience internally at Lumen. I've talked to many other people that do instructional design that have said the same thing. People that do instructional design that have been actively using generative AI, it speeds up the drafting process by at least one order of magnitude. And it's really not hard to see why that's true. If you think about the difference in time and effort between drafting a 15-chapter textbook, say you're going to do that in Google Docs, compared to doing it with the assistance of Claude. It's just not hard to see why it would be so much faster, easier, less expensive to get to that first draft using generative AI. And I do think that we'll see policymakers, philanthropists, others who are charged with being responsible stewards of either public funding or philanthropic funds that have been set aside for a specific purpose. It's hard to imagine that they don't begin requiring new OER to be drafted, at least drafted with AI. Because why would you pay 10x the cost of OER that you could pay if you're trying to be a responsible steward of that funding? Seems like that's the direction that will end up going. And when it comes to revising and remixing traditional OER, I think there are interesting implications here as well, because while open licenses make it legal to revise and remix materials, open licenses don't magically grant you superpowers and skills and expertise that you need to do all the kind of revise and remix that you might wish you could do, like translating a resource into another language. Maybe you don't speak that other language, so the open license gives you permission to do it, but you can't really act on that permission. Or you'd like to create interactive resources based on static resources, or you want to adjust the reading level of a text either down or up so it's more appropriate for the students that you work with. Open education, or this idea of openness, the value of openness, is really at its core about increasing agency. Right? It's about giving people opportunity to do the things that they need to do, want to do, have to do, and getting out of their way, increasing the amount of agency they have so that they can revise, remix, do whatever it is that's going to help them accomplish their local teaching and learning goal. But increasing that opportunity doesn't provide them with all the skills and expertise that they need to necessarily leverage those opportunities. So 2 thoughts here about generative AI and its interaction. Research has shown that and this is OER research that's over a decade old now, the more time and effort that are required to engage in a specific revise activity or remix activity, the less often users will do it. And seems like a very common sense kind of finding, but this is actually looking inside a large repository with multiple different kinds of revise, remix activities that are available, and empirically kind of counting the number of times that people engaged in those activities. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that users are far more likely to delete a chapter or to drag a chapter from here to here, changing its order in the text, than they are to write an entirely new chapter or to make extensive revisions to an existing chapter, because the one takes 10 seconds to do and the other could take days or weeks to do. So inasmuch as generative AI makes a lot of these kinds of tasks faster and easier, I think we should expect a future in which there's a lot more revising and a lot more remixing happening. And I think that is something to be super excited about. Just capability, as we were saying, as I was saying a minute ago, is also an obstacle. You just don't have the skills to do the kind of revising or mixing that you want to do. And here research, now this is generative AI research, has shown that the productivity gains associated with using generative AI are highest, the productivity gains are highest among lower skilled workers, right? So for example, for a translation task, generative AI is going to be a lot more helpful to somebody who doesn't speak the language than someone who's fluent in that language. And here I think I have to insert an obligatory reference to the fact that in the US, in our higher education system, When we graduate PhDs to go on and become university faculty, we don't train them at all in learning science, in pedagogy. We don't prepare them to know what are evidence-based teaching practices or even evidence-based study practices. We give them their PhD in economics or literature or whatever it might be and send them out the door. And they kind of teach the same way that they were taught, which obviously works because look, I got taught that way and I got a PhD. So it seems like that works. So I'll just keep doing that. I guess I'm getting onto a bit of a tangent here, but there really is an evidence base about models for teaching that are more effective than others, ways that you can study that are more effective than others. But our faculty don't, largely speaking, our faculty don't know about that research. And so I think there's a sense here in which you might think of them as having an opportunity to experience some real productivity gains here around revising and remixing activities that are intended to improve the effectiveness of the OER that they're revising and remixing. So on the one hand, we might see, not only might we see more revising and remixing happening in the future, but I think the quality of that revising and remixing can go up as well as faculty, again, who just don't have any training in pedagogy, can be supported in that way through a generative AI tool. So the reason I characterize these as horseless carriage solutions is because I think in the near term, we're going to use generative AI to do exactly the same things we've been doing for the last 25 plus years. We're just going to do them faster, cheaper, and better. And I don't mean to suggest that faster, cheaper, better is not an improvement. It's absolutely an improvement. However, at some point, delivering more precisely cut blocks of ice to people's homes more quickly and at an even lower price kind of misses the opportunity that's presented by the new technology, right? Doing the same things we've always done, cheaper, faster, better, is great for a little while, but we need, and I struggle. I should say every time I say we need, what I'm really saying is I feel like I need, and I'm projecting all of my issues onto you, really need to lift my head up and see more, think more openly and more broadly about the opportunities that are provided by the affordances of generative AI. Because if we stay in this mindset of just doing the same things we've been doing for the last quarter century, but maybe do them a little faster and a little cheaper, then the work that I'm doing, I think the work that many of us are doing really does risk kind of going the way of the CD or the cassette tape. So what might the medium term look like a little bit then? And I like to begin thinking from the position of affordances, right? So I kind of mentioned a few moments ago that I feel like OER is very much kind of an incremental innovation that, there was digital and then there was the internet and then we had open licenses and, what happens at that next layer? How could we characterize this new set of affordances in the context of these older affordances in a way that might give us some insight into where things could potentially go? So let me suggest this way of thinking about it. And I'm sure you'll have other ways of thinking about it. And I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about them in the session after this. But in terms of thinking about digital as an innovation, the thing that digital did is it removed this kind of competition for access as a barrier to education. So now I'm not waiting for that book to go back on the library shelf and I'm kind of competing with others to see if I can get it first when it gets back. But when that resource becomes digital, now I can get access to it without having to worry about who else does or doesn't have it checked out already. So that kind of competition for access is removed as a barrier. The internet kind of famously removes time and place as a barrier because now I can be wherever I want to be and it can be midnight and I can be, online doing my class. So online, the internet removes time and place as barriers. Open licenses remove all the restrictions associated with copyright. as barriers. I can't make copies and give them out to my students. I can't change anything in these materials that don't really work for me. I need better examples. I need different this or different that. I think generative AI, at its core, I think what it does is it removes access to expertise as a barrier to education. And that framing, I think, can suggest some kind of simpler ways of projecting out to what differences might be, and some more interesting ones. If access to expertise is the affordance of generative AI, then kind of taking that in its simplest form, maybe the real implication for students is it answers this question of who do I ask for help when I'm doing my homework at midnight and I get stuck. I look around and my professor's not online, and the people in my study group, I don't know what's going on with them. I might be able to text one of them and get a response, but is that really what you want to be doing at midnight or midnight 30, is answering questions from somebody in your study group? Now, I understand that there are, and I appreciate that there are concerns about generative AI making mistakes and getting things wrong sometimes. And people have concerns about saying, well, when students are stuck, they could ask a generative AI and get some support there. It's absolutely true that generative AI makes mistakes and get things wrong, but you know who else does? The students in your study group are not right 100% of the time in the advice that they give you and the way that they explain things to you. And neither is the person in the tutoring center. And if we're being completely honest, neither are we as instructors. We've all made mistakes at the whiteboard. We've all made mistakes when when we were explaining something, and we've all made mistakes when we were grading that we had to deal with later on. So I worry. I don't want us to find ourselves in a situation, if you were around in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, when education, when universities started putting courses online, there was this kind of insane double standard that online courses, that people initially tried to hold online courses to. And they would conjure up this kind of dream of the most amazing, most effective face-to-face course, like the Platonic ideal of effective face-to-face instruction. And then they would compare that with the worst possible kind of online course that you could ever imagine. And they'd say, see, look how different these two things are. We should really never teach online. This is going to be horrible. And as you went through and kind of checked each of the specific concerns and worries they had about what online courses were going to be like, it turned out that almost all of those were also problems for face-to-face instruction. But we're already doing face-to-face instruction, so I guess we don't need to worry about that. But we're going to hold online classes to this even higher, like almost impossible to achieve bar, all the while kind of winking at the fact that our face-to-face instruction has all the same problems as well. And so this double standard was just made a lot of us really crazy back in the day. I'm sure we're going to end up fighting that same fight with generative AI. We're already fighting that same fight with generative AI, but I hope that we're able to learn that lesson of the late 90s and the early transition to teaching and learning online. Now, Ethan Mollick, and if you don't know who Ethan Mollick is, I hope you do. If you don't, this might be the single most valuable bit you get out of the whole presentation. Ethan Mollick is a terrific follow on LinkedIn. I think he still posts on Twitter. Maybe you can find him. He's a professor at the Wharton School who's focused on entrepreneurship, but has really had previously been focused primarily on entrepreneurship, and is now spending a lot of his time thinking and writing about generative AI. So you should definitely go follow Ethan. But he has this idea, this notion that he calls the best available human. And the question he asks is generative AI going to be more or less helpful than the best human available to me right now for this task that I need to accomplish? And if the answer is it's going to be more useful than the best available human, then you should use AI. So, by this measure, when it's midnight and I'm stuck, I've got 13 more homework problems to do, and I can't figure out how to do any of them, and there's literally no one I can ask who can answer my question, AI is going to be more helpful than the best available human. So it makes sense for me to go and use AI at that point. And I hope that you see that this is not a kind of a blind sort of all in on generative AI characterizations that says we should do away with teachers and we should do away with humans and everything should be all AI. That's not it at all. This question of, is the AI available to me right now going to be more helpful than the best human available to me right now? That's kind of a more subtle question to ask and answer to come up with. And I think it's super pragmatic, and I love that framing for that reason. For faculty, I think in its simplest form, this idea that the core affordance of generative AI is removing access to expertise as a barrier is that it might lead us to ask questions like these, right? What are the most important knowledge, skills, attitudes, et cetera, that students need to learn in my course? Of those ones that are the most important, which of those require the most practice in order to achieve mastery? And of those ones that require the most practice, which of those are the most difficult and time-consuming to provide valuable feedback on? And if you can identify whatever number of skills or concepts or whatever that might be, that seems like that's a really terrific place to think about how you might be able to apply generative AI. Students need lots of practice. Practice is almost worthless without feedback. Maybe we can get into that later on. I've said here below that learning is a function of feedback. Practice without feedback is not super helpful. Practice with very long delays in feedback, where I do my homework and then I find out how I did on it a week later when it gets handed back to me, not helpful. So thinking about places where students need lots of practice and where it's really difficult to provide them with good quality feedback, like there's a place where you can say, hey, I can remove, if access to expertise is no longer a problem, I can just have AI just immediately, consistently provide, good feedback right at the time of practice, so that students right in that teachable moment can find out they were wrong, can get corrected, and move on with their learning instead of waiting 3 days, 5 days, 10 days to get that feedback, which is going to be less detailed and so delayed as to not be helpful anyway. A lot of the ways that we provide feedback today, because it's the best that we can do. And just thinking more about exploring this blend of how could we even more fully blend open education and generative AI together, specifically for the purpose of helping students spend more time engaged in evidence-based study activities. These are ones that are really going to pay off for them, not things like rereading my notes, or reading and highlighting and then going back and looking at my highlighted areas. These are very, very low effectiveness ways of using your time compared to other things that you might do. How can we get students engaged in these more highly effective study activities? I have been thinking about, and the name will probably change at some point, but what in my mind I think of as open educational language models. So it's kind of the OE from OER and the LM from LLM kind of put together. And because that's too much to say, I just think of them as ELMs, right? What opportunities are there for us to inject openness into the different layers of what you might think of as a complete package that a student might work with when they were engaged with generative AI in the context of their learning? So from the bottom up, it's weights, it's fine tuning, it's contextual prompting, and then it's the actual prompt itself. And I want to talk about these in actually a little bit of detail. It's slightly technical. I'm not going to go very deep at all, but I do want to help you, kind of get a sense for what I'm trying to describe. So let's talk about open weights first. Now, for those of you who are totally into this, I'm just purposefully skipping over the debate about what constitutes an open model. I'm not even going to talk, we can talk about it later if you want to. I'm just talking about the model weights. So the model weights in a generative AI model are, if you do any statistics at all, they're very similar to the beta weights that we calculate when we do a simple regression. They're just numbers, like that number there. And this aggregation of all of these kind of beta weights, in the same way that if you had a multiple regression, your model spit out several different values for you there. Those values that are spit out of the training process of a large language model, these are the brains of the model. And they really are just millions or billions of individual numbers organized into matrices. When we say model weights, what we really mean is just these billions of individual numbers that look like this one here, but maybe are four or five times longer in terms of the amount of precision that they're calculated to. And open weights are generative AI model weights that are openly licensed so that we can retain, revise, remix, reuse, and redistribute them. And if you didn't know that that was a thing, it is absolutely a thing. Some generative AI models share the weights under licenses that give us permission to engage in the 5R activities. And this really matters for a couple of reasons. The first is that foundation models are not designed to behave pedagogically. They're designed to make you as happy as they can, as quickly as they can. So if you ask a question, it just wants to answer your question. It doesn't want to give you a question back to reflect on, or maybe provide you a hint first, or try to lead you through a critical thinking process. It just wants to make you happy by answering your question. That is not pedagogical behavior. Foundation models can lack disciplinary knowledge or cultural knowledge or other information that they might need to support teaching and learning effectively. So there are a range of techniques. There are things we can do like contextual prompting or retrieval augmented generation that can temporarily improve a model's knowledge or its behavior. Fine-tuning is a process that permanently changes the model's behavior or its knowledge. And then there's some other techniques that you can use to take these models that, when you download them, are many, many, many gigabytes in terms of their size. There are techniques we can use to make them smaller, and in fact, make them so small that you can run them on your laptop or even on your phone. Put your phone in airplane mode, no connection to the internet, and run a language model on your phone and be able to interact with it and use it. And I think that's very important for the kind of future that we want to create. So I'm going to go through this. I'll invite you to come back and check this out in more detail with the slides. But if you think about 5Rs and open weights, what would it mean to remix a model? Well, part of what it would mean would be fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is this process by which you can do additional training for the model. And that training is based on data that you've curated very specifically so that that additional training will lead to specific changes in the model behavior that you want. For example, you can make it behave more pedagogically. And this curated set of data that you train the model on could be openly licensed. Here's an opportunity. All right, so for example, if your fine-tuning data included 10,000 examples of effective interactions between students and tutors, and you did additional fine-tuning using those data, then after fine-tuning, the model will behave more like an effective tutor because it will have learned from those examples. That's fine-tuning. Distillation is a process by which you use a larger, more sophisticated model to generate that curated set of data that then used to fine-tune a smaller model. And so it's effectively transferring some of the knowledge and the behavior from the larger model down to the smaller model. And again, smaller models are important if we want to be able to retain, if we want to be able to download them, have them on our own devices and run them locally. Quantization is more akin to revising than to remixing. Conceptually, it's similar to, not actually, but conceptually it's similar to rounding, where we might take a number that has 32 digits or 64 digits and truncate it down so that it only has 8. And you significantly reduce the precision, but you also make the size of the file that you have to download and then that you have to put into the memory of your phone or your device, you decrease it dramatically. But open weights really matter because we need to make changes. These models don't behave the way we want them to. They don't know the things we need them to know. And we're not able to run them locally the way that we wish we could. Permission to download and run these smaller models. If you're not familiar with MIT OCW's Mirror Site program, MIT OpenCourseWare takes entire copies of their website, puts it on a hard drive, and sends that hard drive off into places in the world where they don't have any connectivity to the broader internet. They might have Wi-Fi inside a school, but that school isn't actually connected to the internet. If I drop that hard drive into the server in the school, now everybody in the school has access to all of MIT OCW because they found a way to take it offline and make it available offline. That's the same kind of thing we want to be able to do with these large language models, is make them capable of running offline anywhere that needs it for anyone that needs it. And of course, when you're running the model completely locally on your own system, then concerns about privacy completely disappear. No one can see your data. Your data never leave your device. It also addresses issues with like energy consumption because you're not in this huge cloud, you're just running the model on your own phone. And when we're able to adjust the models the way we need to, we're going to be able to increase the likelihood that we're improving learning outcomes. Open prompts. You know, the kinds of prompts that we all wrote at first are pretty simple. But the prompts that you write in order to get a model to engage in an extended interactive or retrieval practice exercise with a student, that prompt might be hundreds or thousands of words long. And guess what happens to it when it becomes long and sophisticated? That's right. Thank you, Berne Convention. That prompt gets automatically copyrighted, meaning that if we want to be able to share it around, we have to openly license it. And again, it's important to be able to have 5R permissions with regard to these prompts, because we're going to need to localize them for linguistic, cultural, other reasons, as well as, you know, maybe I was using Claude when I developed the prompt, but you know, you're using DeepSeek or something else. You're going to need to tweak it in order to really make it work most effectively with the model you're using. That's another important use case for granting 5R permissions to prompts. So with these open educational language models, you know, these 3 levels are all powered by OER. The data that are used for fine-tuning can be openly licensed. This contextual prompting, this is really just a matter of just passing OER the way that you think about it, passing OER into the model as part of the prompt and saying, base your answer on this information. It's a way of helping the responses be more accurate. And then the prompts that we write that kick off these interactive learning exercises, they can also be openly licensed. And so all of that is powered by OER, and the weights themselves are also openly licensed. Now, I've noticed that Amanda has turned her camera on. Are we about out of time, Amanda?
We are. This is so interesting, though. You know, we could listen to you talk for much longer.
Well,
Yeah,
can
want
I have one more minute to just kind of skip to the
one more
end
minute
and wrap
sounds
up?
great.
Like I said, the slides are all available online. I'd encourage you to come look at generative AI enabled pedagogy, which is the analog of OER enabled pedagogy. I've got some really hot takes here I was going to love getting into. You have to dig into the hot takes yourself later on. But here's the last slide. You know, I've spent 27 years of my professional career now kind of working on this traditional OER solution to the problem. And it's hard to kind of start moving on or think about another generation of solutions that build on OER, but are something that's really different. But I think that we owe it to our students to use the best tools available as we're trying to increase their access to and the effectiveness of opportunities. So my call to action to you, my invitation is, let's work together to try to find these perfect blends, ways that we can bring generative AI and open ed together to improve teaching and to improve learning. And that's it. Thank you. There's the QR code I promised.
David, thank you so
Getting
much.
applause.
I wanted to sort of sum up the chat as best I can. I will not do justice for it, but I hope that folks who have been highly engaged in the chat will continue on at 1 p.m. Eastern. But we've had conversations that range from a kitchen fire to a cat typing on a keyboard to more nuanced conversations about accuracy and biases inherent in AI, the need for digital literacy, a question around accountability of the results and the maturity of the models, and the question of human involvement, the concept of co-intelligence or co-authoring, as well as an ongoing fear of monetization of AI. And so I wanted to give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes if you have any thoughts that spring to mind to respond to that, and then we'll have Amanda transition us to the 1 o'clock session.
Yeah, actually, I will. Actually, I'm just going to go back. There's a slide I skipped that I think grumpy is certainly the wrong adjective. I couldn't put my finger on the right adjective here, but I think there's so much that we learned in the early days of the open ed movement that are completely applicable to the moment that we're in now. And so if you find, and I hope that you do, if you find that you're dissatisfied with large language models and the way that they don't support teaching and learning the way that you wish that they might, then I would say, like, remember when you felt the same way about textbooks, that they were too expensive, you had concerns about monetization, concerns about them being inflexible, you couldn't adapt them, you couldn't make them do the things that you needed them to do. What did you do? At that point, you adopted OER and you adapted the OER to make them meet your needs. And there are ways that we can combine the values of openness with generative AI to give ourselves that same opportunity. And I don't think that we appreciate the extent to which we are in control to the same degree that we are with OER. There are some, the Pearsons and the McGraw-Hills of the textbook world have their analogs in the OpenAIs and the Anthropics of the generative AI world, but there are also people on both sides of that creating open textbooks, creating other OER, creating open weights models, creating other open tools. If you're dissatisfied, and again, I hope you are, with the way that LLMs work out of the box, take advantage of these 5R opportunities that are available to all of us through the open weights models and these other open tools to make generative AI do the things we want it to do in the ways we want it to do them, the same way that you make textbooks do what you want them to do, or the same way we approached that 20 years ago with OER.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much, Kevin. And you can hear Kevin and David continue this conversation about taking OER and AI together to the next layer in the next session on the hour. Can't wait to hear the conversations that ensue there, and appreciate everyone being here, the active engagement in the chat, and I will certainly see you in that next session on the hour. Just navigate to the agenda and it's the drop-in session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.